Welcome to the Lessons from Leaders podcast with Brian Beckham. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, there has been a number of news reports that domestic violence incidents, both in America and across the globe, have spiked dramatically. And my next guest speaks to that issue. My next guest is Mekisha Walker. Mekisha worked her way through high school and college and then through law school, and she got a preferred spot at the Harris County District Attorney's Office, one of the largest district attorney's office in the entire country, where, among other things, she prosecuted domestic violence cases while at the same time being a victim of domestic violence herself. In the podcast, Mekisha and I talk about her history, how she worked her way through law school, her career as a prosecutor and now a criminal defense lawyer, and what it was like being a prosecutor and then a criminal defense lawyer while at the same time suffering years of domestic violence from her ex-husband. And now I give you Mekisha Walker. Hey, Brian Beckham at VB Attorneys here, and I have got Mekisha Walker. I've already talked about her a little bit in the introduction. How are you doing today, Mekisha?
I'm doing great. You?
Well, thanks for coming on the podcast. I know you are a criminal defense lawyer, and you have a very busy practice, and so you've got a lot of things going on. But anyway, I appreciate you agreeing to come on the podcast, and you've got a really phenomenal story. And, you know, one of the things that I think a lot of us have been reading about over the last month or so during the pandemic is, among other issues, it looks like we're seeing a rise in domestic violence. And you have a lot of experience with that, personal experience with that, a very unique personal experience with that. And so I want to talk about that quite a bit today, if you can. But before we do that, tell the listeners who you are, where you came from, what you do now. Tell us about your background a little bit.
Sure. So I was raised here in Houston with my two sisters. I have two younger sisters. We grew up in Clear Lake, and I kind of mentioned it in the book, but it was a move that my parents did from Pasadena to Clear Lake, and they wanted to get us in better schools, and we really, couldn't afford to fit in with all the Clear Lake kids. So it was a tough transition, but everybody turned out fine. Went to college, and in the 7th grade, I made a decision that I wanted to be a prosecutor, and I never once wavered in that decision.
Where did that come from? Where did that come from?
You know, I've tried to. I think it was one of my social studies teachers. I don't remember the exact moment that I made the decision, but I remember, telling my parents, I've decided this is what I want to do when I grow up and that sort of thing. So undergraduate was just kind of like, get the degree so you can apply for law school, which I did. Through undergraduate, I waited tables. I even waited tables in high school at like a Golden Corral type place that didn't serve alcohol, so you could waitress there when you were younger. My first job was at Kroger stocking groceries, official job. I did a lot of things to earn money before that. But I've always worked, even through law school. And so, like I said, my end game was wanting to be a prosecutor. And stupidly now, I see that it was not the best move, but at the time, all I wanted to do was be a prosecutor, and Harris County, that's where I wanted to be. And so it was the only place that I applied when I finished law school.
And you went to law school in Houston?
South Texas, yes.
Yeah. And just for people that a lot of people in Harris County and elsewhere know this, but being a prosecutor in Harris County is a big deal. Harris County, what is it, the 3rd or 4th biggest in terms of prosecutorial staff. So pretty big deal to work, well, for any prosecutor, but for the Harris County Prosecutor's Office in particular.
So at the time, Chuck Rosenthal was the DA, and
Sure.
It was a really big deal to get what they call a pre-commit position, where you actually got a call from the elected DA saying, I'm going to hire you. You're going to be allowed to work under somebody else's bar card until you pass the bar, and we get bar results and you're hired. And so long as you pass the bar, then you keep the job. So there was a lot of pressure. That the system's changed a little bit now,
Yeah.
And a pre-commit position or getting hired at the DA's office is not as big of a deal as it used to be, because they're not as selective as they used to be. But at the time, it was a really big deal.
What was
Um,
it? What was it uh, about you in particular? What do you think it was that enabled you to get this pre-commit position? I mean, was it your grades? Was it your personality? Was it a mock trial or something like that?
I think it was a combination of everything. I did law review and varsity moot court, not mock trial. So I was the brief writer on the team and argued occasionally. But every brief that I wrote for South Texas won the national competition that we entered. And then I did really well in law review. I like to write. Obviously, I wrote a book. um, but I think it was a combination of my grades, my extracurricular activity. There was a final decision made after an in-person interview, but I think one of the main reasons I got the interview was the law firm where I worked my third year of law school, which was then Hinton, Sussman, Bailey, and Davidson. And if you've read the book, you know who Joe Bailey is.
Sure. Yeah.
So they, having the influence of having on your resume that you worked for this prestigious boutique criminal trial firm was a big deal as well. So I think it was a combination of everything.
Yeah, and for people that don't know this, I mean, lawyers generally know this, but some people might have this impression that when it comes to mock trial and moot court and things like that, Harvard, Yale, Michigan are the best. But surprisingly to some people, South Texas is generally considered, if not the best law school in the country for moot court. Well, certainly one of the top five. So the fact that you were heavily involved in that is a pretty big deal as far as it goes. And you know, you've got your book in the background, but why did you stay? And we're certainly going to talk about that a little bit. But anyway, so you graduate, you get a pre-commit position at the Harris County DA's office, and then as long as you pass the bar and do all that stuff. So I assume you did that.
Yes, the rule was literally, here's a box, pack your stuff up and walk out the door. So there was a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
I remember the bar is 3 days, and I remember one day I walked out, and I remember throwing up in the bushes when I walked out because I was absolutely convinced I failed. But it all worked out.
I was the same way. When I got done with the bar exam, I was like, I'm not sure I passed, and I will never take another test as long as I live.
Right.
Yeah. So you passed the bar, good deal. And tell us what it's like working in a prosecutor's office like Harris, like a big prosecutor's office. How does, like, when you first get there, what are you doing? What's like the chain of command? What's the, you know, how
Sure.
do you get promoted? Things like that.
So they put you to work right away. The training is on the job. Of course, there's written materials you can look at, but I was literally handed a DWI case my second day of the office.
Wow.
About an hour before the jury was brought over and said, you're going to trial on this case.
Wow.
I didn't have time to watch the video. I barely read the offense report. And, that was a fluke thing. It didn't happen often. But, state's always ready. You've got to be ready and that puts a lot of pressure on the prosecutors because the volume in Harris County is so high. There's just a lot of crime in our area. And so in misdemeanor court, the way it works when you first start out, there's 3 prosecutors assigned to every court. There's a misdemeanor number 3, a 2, and a chief. The chief is in a supervisory position and supervises the 2 and the 3 and helps them with their caseload and their trials. They do have some types of cases that are assigned to them that aren't shipped off to special divisions like, family violence or child abuse or financial crimes or gang unit. But so when you first start out, your run-of-the-mill cases as a prosecutor are DWIs and marijuana, theft, the assault cases, and the DWI blood cases, and some misdemeanors were reserved for the number 2 prosecutor. So obviously, the number 3 is the lowest level. I mean, you could literally be dealing with a prosecutor that doesn't even have their bar card yet when you're trying to negotiate your case.
Yeah.
And then they get promoted to number 2. And then from there, a number 2 prosecutor will get promoted to a felony 3. So they'll go up to felony and hire handle the similar cases that they handled in misdemeanor court. Low-level drug cases, thefts, not a lot of victim cases. And the number 2 in felony handles victims. So, like murder, robbery, things that involve felony, family violence. So once they go up as a 3, then a prosecutor comes back down as a chief and then back up as a 2 or a 3, depending on how you get promoted. Gotcha. So when I was at the office, I left the office as a felony 2.
How long were you there?
Almost 5 years.
Okay.
And, I can remember the court that I was in had a real high trial docket. And this particular judge at the time, her theory was, I'm not going to tip my hand either way on which case I want to go to trial on, because I want everybody to be ready and I want everybody to, think that they're going to have a jury in the hall so we can work out some of these cases.
Yeah.
That resulted in, me having to prepare for, I can remember some Mondays I had 10 trial settings, and you're talking every Monday, and then you're trying to do your work during the week and then get the trials. And so I had all of my witnesses on call and told them, look, if I don't call you and tell you to come down here, we're not going to trial this time. So you could literally have a girl who's about, to testify against her dad for molesting her, a rape victim, all these types of victims that, they just had to wait. And if maybe they got a call, most of the time they didn't, which meant their case didn't go. Yeah. And a lot of times the cases that you prepare for never end up going for one reason or another. And it was the reason I left. It was a culmination of things that were happening. But my grandma passed away, and she and I were very close. And it caused me to reflect and look back on how much time that I was giving the office. And I always had this opinion that I was doing such a good job that if I quit one day, the whole thing was going to fall apart, because I wasn't there anymore. And when I realized that the only thing that was going to happen if I quit was they'd shove somebody else in my spot and keep on going, it kind of made me think about what my priorities were. And since leaving the office in 2006, I have much more time to be a better mom, more time to not work, and, still have a career. So and still go to trial.
Well, and something, Mekisha, and I think you'll agree with this, there's a lot of people that aren't lawyers that have this image that every lawyer, when they graduate from law school, is immediately in the courtroom like you see on TV. And that's not true for the vast, vast majority of lawyers. But for somebody like you, or people that work in the prosecutor's office, I mean, you are, like you said, you're literally day 2 going to trial. So tell us what it was like having to learn how to try lawsuits that quickly. I mean, like just immediately out of law school. You're probably going against lawyers who have 10, 20, 30 years of experience, right? I mean, what was that like?
It's difficult because you're literally learning on the job. Your chief will sit next to you, and chiefs are notorious for kicking your chair, say object, things like that. And so you're trying to concentrate on how you want your trial strategy to go.
That sounds like my law partner. He does that when we're in trial. So
Exactly. Except you're less obligated to feel like you have to do what he says.
Yeah, exactly.
So you learn a lot by making mistakes, and that's okay because they give you cases that they're not super concerned with if you lose. If there's a case that everybody's going to freak out if somebody loses it, well, you're not touching it because you've been here 3 months. So
yeah.
I can remember one of the first DWI trials I had. This was back when they didn't, if you refused a breath test, they didn't do blood draws like they do now. And we called those no test, no accident cases. I mean, it's literally a traffic stop, no science evidence, just look at the video and tell us what you think. And those are truly one of the hardest cases to win as a prosecutor. But I remember one that I had, it was either my first or my second. And I was going up against a very experienced attorney. I mean, he'd probably been practicing 30 years. And he brought in, for the defense witness, he says, the defense now calls Mattress Mac.
Yeah.
What is happening right now?
What are you going to do about that? Yeah.
No, and it's in criminal law, as a defense, you have the autonomy and the element of surprise. You don't have to list your witnesses to the state. You don't have to tell them this is who I'm going to call. So I'm sure you can imagine how shocked I was in a run-of-the-mill DWI case where, they're calling Mattress Mac in to testify.
My God.
So that was my first cross-examination.
Yeah.
Was Mattress Mac.
Unbelievable.
The client had worked at his warehouse, moving stuff around. And so he just came in to testify because in a DWI case where there's no blood or breath test, the state law says that the prosecution has to prove loss of normal use of mental or physical faculties. And that's an opinion crime. And so he came in, this witness came in and he testified in his opinion after having watched the video and having knowledge of how the defendant walks and moves normally, that he wasn't intoxicated. Yeah. I lost everyone, but
well, I mean, Mattress, what a story. Mattress Mac, for people that aren't in Houston, Mattress Mac is a absolute Houston icon. He's got such a recognizable voice and stuff like that. That story reminds me a little bit of a story I heard when John Connally, the governor of Texas, was on trial in Washington, D.C. for, I think, some sort of fraud or some sort of ethical violations of some sort. He's in trial, and he called the Reverend Billy Graham as a character witness. And apparently the lawyer, the first question they ask is, introduce yourself. Oh, my name is Billy Graham. What do you do for a living, Mr. Graham? I preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to the masses. And 3 of the jurors said, Amen. And they kind of knew they had lost at that point. So, wow, your first trial, Mattress Mac. So tell us, if you will, are there any, so you spent some time, and I think this is important for what we're about to start talking about. You actually spent some time working as a prosecutor on domestic violence cases, right?
I did.
So tell us about that experience, whether there are any particular cases that maybe stand out in your mind, or what it was like to be a prosecutor on domestic violence cases.
Sure. So the first family violence I had was as a misdemeanor number 2. That's your first opportunity to get one of these types of cases. And once I tried a couple, I figured out that I really enjoyed them. And was then transferred at some point to the misdemeanor division for the family criminal law division. So the DA's office has specialty divisions like animal cruelty, sex crimes, child pornography issues. And there's different criteria for which cases get pulled to the divisions to be tried by division prosecutor versus a trial court prosecutor. But in family violence, that trigger is when you have a complaining witness, a victim, that says, I don't want to go forward, I don't want to testify, no, that's not what happened, they're changing their story or minimizing it in some way, then the trial court prosecutors will ship that case off to the family criminal law division to be better supported, because those prosecutors, that's all that they try.
Yeah.
And there's more social workers, caseworkers, and investigators that help with those cases in that division.
Those are the cases where, and we've all heard of these, where there's a episode of domestic violence, and then at some point, for some reason, and I'm hoping that you will talk about this, both your personal experience and your prosecutorial experience, but at some point the victim decides, I don't want to move forward. And I'm sure there's tons of reasons why that may happen, but you specialized as a prosecutor in the domestic violence cases where maybe there was a problem with the witness, or the victim wasn't cooperating, things like that. Tell us, like, how do you make, because I know there's going to be people that are going to be thinking, well, if the victim doesn't testify, if the victim won't confirm what happened, how can you move forward? Like, how do you prove that case?
Well, technically, how you meet the elements that are alleged in the information of assault is different now than it was when I was a prosecutor. When I was a prosecutor, Crawford had not, the leading case on hearsay, and had not affected our cases. And so back then, an officer could come in and testify and say, she told me this, and not have any, sustained hearsay objection. And so a lot of times those cases, your officer was the only person. And so to answer your question, you have to do a really good job in voir dire when you're selecting the jury to make sure that the jurors that they can agree that even if the complainant doesn't want to go forward, they understand why the state would want to follow up and they can follow that law.
Yeah.
And as you know, not everybody tells the truth in voir dire, and it doesn't always work out the way that you want it. But the idea is to get people that are okay with the state prosecuting, even when the victim doesn't want to.
Yeah. So, but those are obviously much more difficult cases to win. And I want to transition now. So you're prosecuting domestic violence cases, and your specialty is cases in which there's problems with the testimony of the victim and related things like that. At the same time that this is going on, you are having your own personal issues with domestic violence in your life, right? So tell us about, and before we get into this, you've actually written a book about it. The book is in the background. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's in the background. If you're listening to it on the podcast, then the book is called But Why Did You Stay? And by the way, fantastic title. But I've read the book, and I encourage everybody listening to get the book and read it. It's available on Kindle. You can also get a hard copy or a soft copy, but it's a harrowing book in many ways. It's also it's in some ways inspiring, but it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating to me, and I think to a lot of people, that a prosecutor who is prosecuting domestic violence cases and knows the signs is a victim at the same time she's doing that in her personal life. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the way the timeline worked out is when I started prosecuting these cases as a felony, a misdemeanor too, that was about 2003. And 2003 is when I met my ex-husband. The physical abuse in our relationship didn't happen until after we were married in 2005. So I wasn't experiencing, in my misdemeanor rotation, I wasn't experiencing actual physical violence. Later on, yes. But I think, I can remember trying those cases and thinking to myself, just being so not understanding domestic violence at all.
Yeah.
Having a hard time having empathy for the women who, had 8 prior incident reports, and the husband or the boyfriend or whatever just keeps beating her up, and just thinking to myself, what am I supposed to do with this? If she doesn't want help and she doesn't want to get out of this situation, then why am I even bothering?
Yeah. Exactly. And at the same time, whether your experience with your ex-husband was physical or not, you were clearly, there were things that he was doing that you describe in great detail in your book that are not normal, that were clearly abusive. And but it's interesting. So how do you explain, Mekisha, like the cognitive dissonance where you're prosecuting or you're working on these types of cases, and at the same time you're having the same issues, like you're questioning the victims as a prosecutor, and you're not, how do you reconcile those two things in your head?
Well, I don't think they're far off. You're thinking, initially, before there was any abuse in my life, my thought was, well, it's against the law. It's wrong for a man to hit a woman, whatever.
Yeah.
And that, I think, transitioned into, I've always been very passionate about everything that I do. And I always wanted to win my trials. So, there was just this incentive there anyway, combined with wanting to make a difference in the victim's life.
And the other thing that we haven't mentioned, which makes this entire situation even more out of the ordinary, is your ex-husband was a police officer.
He was. So that's actually, how we met, because I was a prosecutor and he was a police officer, and we had a lot in common. And, I think my initial perception of him, obviously he didn't show me truly who he was right away.
Yeah.
And the person that he showed me, that's the person that I fell in love with. And
Yeah.
so when you'd have instances of verbal abuse or, red flags, my thought process was, that's not who he is. He's this person and he's having a bad day,
Yeah.
or he's stressed, or whatever was going on at the moment. Instinctively, because I loved him, I would make an excuse for that behavior, and it was unchecked. And because of that, it continued to escalate over the years.
So you have a description in your book when you first met your husband. If I'm remembering this correctly, he was working security, and you were with some friends, and you saw him across the room and said, "Man, that is a really good-looking man." And you wanted to meet him, and you met him that night, and then things moved pretty quickly. And you describe in your book, I mean, it's almost like you can feel the heat being turned up. It's kind of slowly gets worse and worse over the years. So tell us, what was it like at the beginning of the marriage? Like, how was it going, and what were the first signs you saw that something might be off? And the reason I'm asking you these questions, Mekisha, is I'm positive there are people on the phone call that would want to know what kind of signs they should be looking for early on.
Well, I think it's important to mention that there's a lot of people out there, just everyday people, who think domestic violence doesn't have anything to do with them because, they're not abusive. They're not in an abusive relationship. They've never known anybody that it's happened to, although they probably did.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think that, I've had so many of my friends and obviously my family come back and, tell me it all makes sense now. I see everything now.
Yeah.
So, red flags are going to be different for every person and every relationship. Some of the things that I experienced that I think are common are obviously jealousy.
But I mean, jealousy on a whole another level, really, right? I mean, some of the things you describe in terms of and I actually made some notes. You talk about a lot of domestic abusers are very territorial, and they try to isolate people. They try to isolate women or men. I guess men could be the victims of domestic violence too. They try to isolate them from their friends and family. So
right.
Talk about that, kind of the early stages when you say jealousy. Like, give us some examples of some of the episodes that you went through with your ex-husband.
Well, I can remember one day, when you walk in the courthouse, you turn your ringer off because your phone can't ring in the courtroom. It's habit. We all do it. Then at the time when I had just gone out into private practice, I got an office at Franklin and Main downtown, which is a couple blocks from the courthouse. I walked to my office. I had a client meeting, met with the client. The whole while I'd forgotten to turn my ringer on because I was late to the meeting, and then we started talking to the client. Well, I walk out of my office and my ex-husband was standing there on the sidewalk right in front of me. And, initially I was startled, and he accused me of, since I didn't answer my phone, I was in my office having sex with someone. And I was like, my office has a glass door. And he's like, I know you were, and I think he said something like, you're a dirty line bitch or something. He took his wedding ring off and threw it into the street. Yeah. And so it's there were a lot of jealous incidents, but I think a true man is secure enough in the relationship that, let's be frank, if somebody wants to cheat in a relationship, they're going to.
Yeah.
And so no amount of jealousy on the other person's part is going to prevent that. But I think that people who are normal people that are secure don't question your every move when you're not with them.
It's almost like, and tell me if you agree with this or not, it's almost like the jealousy gets to a point where it's like the person feels like they own you. Like you, Mekisha, are my property, and I own you. And if somebody, and if you do something else with somebody, then they're basically stealing from me, right? It's such a bizarre attitude, right?
I haven't thought about this in a long time, but you made me think about it when you said property. He used to call me his chattel.
Yeah, yeah. See, unbelievable. And there's other stories in there. Like there's a story where you talk about going to a wedding,
Mhm.
and as I remember, I think you were in the wedding, in fact, weren't you? Yeah. And was it a relative or a close friend of yours?
My best friend since fifth grade. We
Yeah, it
grew
was
up.
your best friend's wedding. And you fly to this wedding, and your husband is literally making you essentially trying to make you leave. The second you get there, he won't interact with anybody, none of the friends. And again, I want to mention this because I know all the red flags are different, and there are probably a countless number of red flags, but there are certain things that are pretty strong indicators that something is wrong. And so this one thing that really comes through in your writing is the complete and total lack of empathy that your ex-husband had for anybody but himself. And I mean, some of the stories are just it's just like you're just like, what happened to this person? I mean, this person is very damaged. So talk a little bit about the instances where there was just no empathy. There's just like no emotion. I mean, it's just it's very well written and
Well,
impactful.
thanks. I remember one incident. I was 7 months pregnant with my daughter, who is now 8.5, almost 9. And I remember for some reason I'd woken up, went to the bathroom, came back to bed, and for some reason I was feeling under my armpit. I don't know why. And I felt a lump. And I told him about it, and I was like, what if it's cancer? All these hormonal things going through my mind. Like, am I going to have to, sacrifice going through chemo for the baby? Just like these tainted thoughts because you're
Yeah,
pregnant.
yeah, for sure, for sure.
And, he told me, be quiet. There's something wrong with you. And it turned into, I think the trigger was I told him that I feel so alone. Even though you're right here with me, I feel alone. And he
Yeah,
just snapped,
yeah,
spit in my face and started punching me, held a gun to my head, ended up leaving the house, which was his MO. He always did that. And then he would call and make sure that coast was clear to come back. And, he always checked my phones when he got back to see if I'd been talking to anyone. And I don't know why this particular night he didn't check my phone. And I don't know why this particular night I was daring enough to record, but I set my phone to record audio and I put it in the nightstand and shut
yeah,
the drawer. And so I have this recorded conversation. It was the first one I had in the course of documenting what happened to me. But I have a recorded conversation where, I say everything that just happened and talk about how if he had shot me, I would hope the neighbors would get over there in time to cut the baby out and all this. And, his response was, well, you don't know what it's like for me. You don't know what it's like for me to hurt the ones that you love,
yeah.
you
That's
know?
unbelievable. Yeah, and you actually, and now would be a good time to talk about this. By the way, I love the title of the chapter, "Amazing Grace." Your daughter's Grace, and
Yes.
what a great title of that chapter. Good, really good chapter too. But so the it's really hard for people to imagine how bad it can get. And like the title of your book is perfect, but why did you stay? And so now is probably a good time because so tell us, like, chronologically, at first, and you're very clear about this in your book, at first there was no physical violence, there was no physical abuse. That took some time. Tell us, like, how did the chronology go until there started to be, until it was more than just emotional violence? And by the way, when I say just emotional violence, I mean that can be just as bad as physical violence in many ways. So I'm not trying to downplay the emotional component of it, but walk us through the chronology. Like, how long did it take until the physical violence started?
So we got married in 2005, and he came home. I left the office in 2006, and shortly after that, he came home one night and told me he'd quit his job because he had started law school and it was too much and he couldn't do all of it.
Yeah,
So during that time period, I chalked up a lot of his bad behavior to the stress of law school because it's stressful. I can remember him, breaking a vase that my grandmother gave me and me excusing it in my mind, thinking, well, he's not being violent with me. He just took out his frustration in a nonverbal way. And although I recognized that that wasn't okay, I somehow rationalized it away.
And he was, just to be clear, like, it wasn't random that he broke that particular item. Like, he was trying to find things that were important to you. And as you write in the book, you're somebody, and I'm the same way. I have a lot of keepsakes that are important to me emotionally, but he would literally pick out stuff that was important to you. It wasn't like he was just, throwing an orange across the kitchen because he was in a bad mood. I mean, he was intentionally trying to hurt you emotionally.
Right. I mean, Christmas trees kicked over, ornaments broken. I have an ornament collection. I collect Christmas ornaments, and I have an ornament that my great grandmother started for every year since I was born, 1974. And there were some just very sentimental things broken that night. But, the progression from verbal breaking things, the verbal started to get worse before it turned physical. There was an incident where I really thought that I was going to die, where he threatened to kill me, threatened to kill my mother, had the gun out, said, you really, I'm going to show you what real pain is. And it was during that time that I started writing in a journal, which I call it a journal, but it was really like a legal tablet. And I'd write down what happened the night before, rip the pages off, and then I put it in my office. And I had let my sisters know, look, if anything ever happens to me, have a journal. It was told him it was in my office, and the outside of the folder said, I'm sorry if you're reading this, it means I'm dead. I wish I could have told you this while I was alive. And it was my journal.
Whoa.
And that progressed to a point where he had repeatedly told me, look, no one's ever going to believe you. You've never been believed. And you walk in that courthouse every single day. You've got unlimited resources at your fingertips. And if you try to use this, there's not going to be any proof. And I think, like, in the back of my mind, to prove to myself that it was happening, because I was being told so much, no one's going to believe you, nothing's happening to you, you're overreacting, that it was my outlet. And the journaling turned into, I would take a picture of an injury and print it out and then put it in my office so that it was not on my device or anywhere so you could see it. He would say some really horrible, threatening things, like he was going to drown us all in the bathtub and set the house on fire. And so it was during one of these incidents that he left and then called me on the phone, and we were talking on the phone, and he was saying these really horrible things. And it was that time I decided I should record this, because nobody's going to believe he's saying the things he's saying. So the first time I recorded a phone call, I went and got a handheld tape recorder, because I didn't, wasn't fluent in recording apps. And this was 2011. So, it's more common now. But anyway, so I held a handheld tape recorder up to my phone, and that call, like he said on that call, he was going to bite my trachea out of my throat.
Unbelievable.
Can you imagine me trying to tell you right now that he said that without having the audio? Who says that? No one's, they're going to think I'm crazy and that I made it up.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
and this is something, Mekisha, that when I read this part of the book, this really hit me pretty hard, because I think there's no clear answer. There's a section where you basically say your husband told you nobody's going to believe you because you've never reported it. No, right. You've never said anything. And I'm sitting there thinking, man, that is a difficult situation for a victim to be in, because you don't want to just run to the cops over something that's not that big a deal. I mean, every couple has arguments. Every couple yells at each other, and you don't want to just run to the cops. But the question is, when do you do that? And if you don't do that, then for sure the abuser is going to say exactly what your husband did. So you talk about, and I think this is super important, that's why I wanted to flag this. You talk in your book about, I started writing a journal specifically because of what my husband said about this. So would you, for the people that are listening that may be in a situation similar to yours or know people that are in that, is that one of the big recommendations you have for people, is keep some sort of secret journal just so you have some evidence?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's always a good idea if you're not sure what you're going to want to do, and I think journaling mentally is helpful because, you can't go and talk to people about it, or you feel like you can't because you know that the person that you talk to is going to say, hey, you need to get out of the relationship.
Yeah.
And, possibly pass judgment on you or make the victim feel like, you're stupid for staying. It's everyone can see it. Why don't you get out?
Yeah.
And so I think one of the main reasons I wanted to be so open and honest about specific situations in the detail that I used was because I want other people to, if they read the book, to see, look, it happened to her, the same thing's happening to me, because this is all silence driven.
Yeah.
And the abuser is counting on the fact that the victim is not going to say anything.
Yeah.
And I think people are afraid to speak out for lots of reasons. Some people might have financial reasons. Some people are scared. Some people don't want to, get a divorce and then have their husband get first, third, and fifth weekend and not have any control when, the kid's at the dad's house. And so they stay just so the home can stay as one. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons.
Some people, I think, at least I've heard this, some people just blame themselves and they just say, this is all my fault that I put myself in this situation. And
well, abusers are very good at flipping the script. And, in the audio that I have, you'll hear a lot of, why did you do this to me? Why did you make me do this?
Yeah.
And,
I know it's just bizarre listening to some of this stuff. Like, he's abusing you physically and he's mad. He's getting mad because he's blaming his own abuse on you. It's bizarre. But tell us, so what, there's a very vivid scene in the book about a incident involving an automobile. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about that incident and then talk about what it was that finally convinced you to take some action on this?
Well, it was actually that incident.
Yeah.
So, that was the culminating incident. It was the first time that he had ever assaulted me outside of the home.
Yeah.
And I had to be transported to the hospital. I got over 100 stitches, rainbow shape, starting here, going over to my left ear, 100 stitches, staples, and
explain to the listeners like what exactly it was that happened, because there's something really, really, really important in the way you described the story. The way you're describing it is he was basically driving you someplace where there was nobody else there. And I actually listened to a podcast from an international security expert, a guy named Gavin DeBecker. He's like in charge of Jeff Bezos' security and stuff like that. And he had two bits of advice that I tell all the women in my life. I've got a daughter and I've been married for almost 20 years now. One of them is, if somebody tries to abduct you and take you to a different location, you should do everything you can to resist that. That is the worst thing you could do, is let somebody move you to a different location. So as I'm reading your book and you're describing being driven to some essentially a dark back alley, I'm just in my head thinking, oh, this is not going to be good. So tell us, describe the experience, if you
what
would.
I was thinking. So that particular night, it was the Harris County Criminal Defense Lawyers Association Christmas party, which is a big deal that happens every year. It's well attended by judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and it's a good time. Well, at that party, a colleague of mine who at the time was a prosecutor did like a drive-by slap on the ass, and I was standing right next to my ex-husband, and he freaked out. Long story short, he went around the club, tried to find him, and then we ended up leaving. I didn't want to ride home in the car with him, and I made some calls to try to get him picked up, but it didn't work. He promised, nothing's going to happen. I'm not mad at you. I'm mad at him. And then when he got in the car, he kept telling me, I'm taking you to the police station and you're going to file an assault report on this guy. And I said, no, I'm not. He's a prosecutor. I work with him every day. I'm not filing an assault report. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. And then he just backhanded me like this. He was driving, so with his right hand. He only hit me once, but it instantly broke my nose. There was blood everywhere. And we were coming up to the light at Kirby and 59 to go south, get on 59. And he pulled in the Hooters parking lot and started to drive behind the IHOP where it was dark. And something in me very loudly told me, you cannot go back there. You need to
Yeah.
get out of the car.
Yeah. Danger, danger. By the way, not to interrupt you, but that's another thing DeBecker says is trust your intuition, trust your gut. Like that, it's there for a reason. We've evolved as humans to have these like almost subconscious danger sensors, and so your sensors were going off at the time.
Right. And,
Yeah.
I think I mentioned in the book that that's one of the things that bothers me to this day was my inability to not hear my gut.
Yeah.
I've always been able to get a really good read on people. It's helped me be a better trial attorney because I can connect with people in voir dire. And my gut's always right when I pick someone. It's weird.
Yeah.
But with him, he got past me.
Yeah.
He was so charming and so manipulative that it got to a point where I didn't realize that I was dismissing these red flags.
So he takes you, he breaks your nose with one punch in this parking lot, and what happens next?
So I pushed up the lock on the Tahoe, and I was going to step out onto the running board and just walk away because he was going very, very slow. Well, he saw me lift the lock and realized I was getting out, and so he immediately punched the gas and turned to go back behind the IHOP. And when he did that, it caused me to fall out, and my head hit the ground first. It was the first thing to hit the ground, and so that's what caused that major gash. You could see my skull. He fled, left the scene, and people were calling 911, telling them I got run over by a car because how bad my injury was. And then he ends up coming back to the scene and getting out of the car and trying to tell all the witnesses, look, it's okay. This is my wife. I'm a police officer. Everything's fine. Thankfully, one of the witnesses took his car keys and he ended up running away on foot. That incident for me was, I think, definitely what did it. But I think the reason it did is because I had worked so long and so hard to keep everything a secret and put on this facade that, I have a normal life, I have a normal marriage, nothing's wrong, everything's fine. And finally, the secret was out. And so at that point, I felt more comfortable. But it took me many years. After this happened, I tried for years to get people to forget about it. Didn't want to talk about it. Didn't want to do anything with it.
It's so interesting to me to hear that. And I think this is really important also for our listeners, because I can imagine you as a former prosecutor who did domestic violence cases, about domestic violence, and you have a reputation as a good criminal defense lawyer, and you don't want people to know about this. Like and so you're probably thinking, well, I should know even better than most people because of what I did for work. But that's not really true. I mean, I can imagine, you might have somebody that is a stay-at-home mom that has what appears to be a great life, but she has things like this going on in her background that nobody knows about. And one of the reasons maybe that women in general or abuse victims in general don't want to report this stuff is because of the embarrassment and the shame of this stuff getting out. But then once it was public, I hear what you're saying is once it came out, then it was kind of the cat was out of the bag.
Yeah, because I was very concerned about my reputation and the impact that this, relationship might have on that reputation. And
so what would you tell people? What would you tell women that had those kinds of concerns, like women that were worried about this sort of thing becoming public? What would you tell them?
Well, I would tell them that once you really start looking at things, you'll find that victims of domestic violence and survivors are some of your strongest people because they're able to survive mentally and get through everything they have to get through. But, what I tried to tell people in my book and what I tried to convey by the detailed things that I talked about was that although it is personal and you can feel shame, it's not your fault. And things get better if you talk about it.
Yeah. It's interesting how when things come out in the open, when you shine a light on it, sometimes it brings down the shame or the fear or whatever emotions you're feeling. So what after the incident, you said you were taken to the hospital. Walk us through kind of how the relationship progressed after that.
Well, at that point, I made a decision that I didn't want to be with him anymore. It was just the epiphany for me. My daughter is now, at the time, was 5 months.
Yeah.
And so I took her and stayed at my mom's house, got everything I needed out of the other house, and was scared to tell him that he was asking me to come home. And I was scared to tell him that I wasn't going to come home because I was afraid that it would be too much and he would snap. So initially, I didn't tell him that I wanted to leave him. And I told him, look, I just need some time. I'm going to stay at my mom's for a little while. But ultimately, January 1st, I told him that, look, I don't want to be in this relationship anymore. I don't want to be abused anymore. I actually made a copy of all my journal and I left it on the porch for him with a letter and told him I just want to be left alone.
There's a story there's something that not to interrupt you, but you talk about putting your fingerprints on each page of your journal. Tell us, because that really, I was like, whoa, what a great idea that is. Why did you do that?
Well, for the same reason that I kept the journal. I didn't have any intention when I created this pile of documents when I did it, that it was going to be used in court.
Yeah.
My intention was that it was going to be used to explain to my family what happened in my life. Because he'd say before, I'll bury your body somewhere, they'll never find you. But I knew that I had told my sisters about the journal, and so I knew they'd get it, and then they would know. And so there was one point where things started escalating right before the Christmas event that I thought to myself, what if he does murder me, which I felt was high probability? How would, just thinking about a prosecutor, how would you get these notes into evidence? You're going to have a handwriting analysis. You're going to have someone say, yes, that's hers. And so to eliminate that step for the prosecutor, I got an ink pad and just put my thumb on every page in my journal.
Unbelievable. So you were, I interrupted you, but you were talking about you had finally reached the breaking point, and you had a 5-month-old daughter at the time, Grace. So how were you ultimately able to separate? Because, there's a couple other things we haven't talked about. Your ex-husband was an elected official at one point, right? And as a matter of fact, I think this is really funny because when we were setting up this interview before we had met, I heard Mekisha Walker, and I thought you were Black. And you talk about that in your book. And really the name is from I think you said your mother named you after an Indian princess, but there was a point in time in which your husband was literally, when he was running for office, you talk about this in the book, making you change your name.
Yeah,
right?
we moved to another county, and I don't have a middle name. I've never had a middle name, but I've always been called my grandma's middle name. When I was growing up, they called me Mekisha Jane, and Jane was her name. And so he wanted me to change my name to Jane. So I legally did a name change where I added Jane as my middle name officially. Yeah. And so I could go by that. So I could get it on my checks everywhere, so that when I would attend these political functions with him, that's how I would be known.
Yeah.
Because he didn't want anyone to think that he was married to a Black person.
Yeah. And that was a political thing, but that's just another example. And there's all sorts of examples littered throughout the book of this extremely manipulative behavior. So how did you finally, and by the way, Mekisha, I have a call at 3, but I'm having such a good time. If you have a few more minutes, can we keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. So, because there's a couple things that are super important that I want to make sure that everybody hears from you about, but how were you finally able to separate, and how did that all work, and how are things going for you now on that front?
So, my supervisor at the DA's office, when I had been there, she was still there. She was trying to call me. The detective that the case had been referred to, he was trying to call me. So, and I was still talking to Jason at this point. Luke at this point. And I was living with my mom. And so, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
About how you finally got separated from him, finally got away from this.
Right. So, the secret's out, and I knew that this was my opportunity to break away with, if I used caution and did it in a way that didn't trigger him. So the divorce proceedings started, they became contested until he finally agreed to give up rights to Grace and relinquish his parental rights. And so then, we were agreed again. And then his son, who I had raised since 4 and adopted him, and he was, I think, 13 at the time, sent me a text message saying, my dad's been talking about killing himself, and I think and taking me with him, and I think he's going to do it. And so I went and got him, and then the divorce became contested at that point because he said he's willing to agree to termination on Grace because he didn't want to pay child support on a kid for 18 years that I was going to brainwash anyway, but he wasn't willing to terminate us to Ryan. Ultimately, he ended up agreeing. Parental rights were terminated on both children, and I, during that time period, in 2012, reconnected with a high school friend that I talk about in the book, and he's actually my husband now.
Nice.
And
congratulations.
I talk about, he's adopted Grace, and Grace knows that she's adopted, and she's totally okay with it. But, I mentioned it in the book, but I would literally go through everything I went through in that whole relationship 100 times more to be where I am today, to be with someone who knows how to treat a woman and who is not mean to you and obviously doesn't hit you, and who's a good parent and just a good partner. You like hanging out with them. So, the end of the story is a happy ending. I'm in a good place. He ended up, my ex, had several cases going on. There was an assault here in Harris County, and then one in Galveston, and then he also got a DWI in Galveston. He ended up pleading guilty on all 3 cases. He took an 8-year deferred on an aggravated assault out of Galveston County, and after 5 years was requesting to get off the probation. So I decided that I would agree to that because he wanted to move out of state. I would agree to that if he agreed to a lifetime protective order. So conceivably, he moved really far away, doesn't live here anymore, has a new wife, has kids with her. So, it ended great.
Good. Well, I'm so happy to hear that. And so let me, I have a couple questions that I think are really important that that people want to hear from you about. So question number 1 is, and I know this is a long answer, and it's a complicated answer, but why did you stay? What's the answer to that question?
So, I chose this as the book cover because it was the most commonly asked question. And I think people don't understand that when you ask someone that's been a victim of domestic violence, it's the equivalent to saying, how stupid are you? Why are you still in that relationship?
It is. You're right. Yeah.
But I used to say the same thing about the victims that I would represent as a prosecutor. I mean, what's wrong with her?
Yeah.
And so there's this, I think one of the reasons people don't talk about it, women don't come forward, is because there's this shame in having, allowed someone to do this to you repeatedly and not be smart enough to pick yourself up and move out of that situation. So initially, why did I stay was because I loved him. And I was in love with the person who he pretended to be, not knowing that the person he was being was actually the evil one.
Yeah.
That slowly over time morphed into a state of confusion. Like, do I want to stay? Do I want to go? Do I want to, try to help him get better mentally and get through this and not have another failed marriage? Or, and then ultimately to a point where there's threats to kill my family, threats to kill me. And I actually believed that if I left, there would be nowhere to go.
Yeah. Yeah. That's something that most people, including me, haven't thought about. Like, if you leave, it's not like what are you going to do? Go live on the street? I mean, there's just all these sorts of questions that unless you're in the situation, it's hard to.
Right. I mean, you can change cars, you can stay in a different house, but most people can't change their jobs.
Yeah.
So that particular pattern of
Great point. Yeah.
Learning about, because, the husband or the abuser knows the routine. So they know where you park, they know what time you go to work. And if they wanted to find you, they could.
That is a great segue into what I think is a crucial topic right now. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and everybody's anxious to begin with. Some people are depressed. Some people are drinking too much. Some people are having anger problems. And we're all, for the most part, kind of cooped in close together. And so there's been stories that domestic violence has been on the rise, which is not surprising, I don't think, to anybody. What would you tell people? And I'm not just talking about victims of domestic violence. I'm talking about their friends and people that are around them. What would you tell them in terms of the signs? And I know we've already talked about this a little bit, but the red flags, the things to look for. And then secondarily, what would your advice be to people in that situation? And like I said, it's particularly complicated right now when you're in a pandemic. I mean, if you're a victim of domestic violence right now, where are you going to, I mean, seriously, where are you going to go? What can you do? So are
And
there,
there's that fear of, if the police do come out that night and he gets arrested, he's just going to make bond, and then he's back even angrier than he was before.
exactly. Yeah.
So, you said first.
What kind of signs? Because, there's a lot of people that I think are like, clearly somebody hitting somebody else and breaking their nose. That's clearly domestic violence.
Right.
Get in an argument where you're just yelling at each other. That's just normal. That happens. So how do you differentiate between true over the line behavior, true domestic, like what kind of signs, but I know at the time, maybe you didn't recognize it, but looking back now, what kind of signs would you tell people to look for?
I think making excuses. If you find yourself making excuse after excuse for someone else's, behavior, you have to ask yourself, why am I having to excuse his behavior? Why can't he excuse his own? And why does he keep doing those things to make you have to feel like I'm going to forgive him? Yeah. So, it's like right now with this pandemic, it's like you spend the night at your best friend's house when you were a kid 3 nights in a row. And by the end of that, you remember you're arguing. And,
yeah.
So I think, the lockdown and the home confinement has been kind of like that on steroids.
Yeah.
And in a normal relationship, you might have, somebody, they have an argument and then one person leaves to go cool off. Well, that's not as easily done these days.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Everything's heightened, everything's more intense. And so, my advice to a victim would be, there's a lot of resources out there that talk about how to make a plan, specific things about how to rat hole money away so you can have some when you leave.
Are there any particular resources that you, like specific ones that you would recommend?
I mean, obviously you've got the, National Victim of Domestic Violence website, and that's going to have resources that can connect you locally. But there's just a lot of stuff out there on the internet. I don't think there's like one particular place that has everything that I've looked at. I mean, you kind of have to click around, but they all the websites have an escape button. So if he were to walk in the room, you could just hit leave.
Really? Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Yeah.
Get off it real quick so you don't get caught, because
And see, that's the kind of thing that people that haven't been through this, that I wouldn't even consider that. I wouldn't even think about that. And there's all sorts of things like that unless you've been through it, you just don't even think about, like, oh, do I need to erase my web browsing history? Stuff like that.
Yeah. And, typically people that are abusers are the type of person that are jealous, and they're going to be looking at things like that. So you have to be careful, but there's so much information and so many resources out there to help people get out of these relationships, not just financially, but, how to learn how to, live without being dependent to someone else.
So what would you, and I don't mean to call you out, but let's say somebody's listening to this podcast right now and they want to reach out to you. Like, how would they get in? Because you run a successful criminal defense law firm right now. And so there may be some people that either would want to just reach out to you directly, or they want to get a copy of the book. So tell people how, first of all, where they can get a copy of the book. Number two, where online or elsewhere they can get in touch with you if they want to.
Sure. So the book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and also my website at butwhydidyoustay.com. there's contact information for me on the website. And also on the website, we've talked a little bit about evidence collection. So as you read the book, there's a section on the website that says chapter attachments, and you can pull it down and it has a corresponding chapter 1, chapter 2. And so the things that I talk about in that chapter, whether it's a 911 call or a photograph or an audio recording, it's under that tab. So you can look at photos, you can hear things, because, you know, tone is very important in situations like this. And I think that a lot of women will find connection because they'll have experienced similar things. But the other thing I wanted to do was really try to get through to people. You know, we all have, you know, a daughter, a sister, a mom, females in our life that we care about. And if you as a person think that domestic violence is not going to come to your doorstep, it couldn't happen to someone that you love, you know, like your daughter, then you're not going to be as aware and therefore not able to help them. And there's lots of resources about how to help without getting shut out, because it's a fine line. Because if, you know, the victim feels like they're not quite ready to leave yet and a timeline is being pushed, you have to get out, that can cause a situation where the victim completely shuts down and stops talking to that person. And so then you're completely out and you have no way to help.
Yeah. Well, Mekisha, I'm cognizant of your time. This has been an unbelievable interview. You're a warrior, by the way, and you've been through a lot, and I cannot tell you how important this kind of stuff is, especially now when we're going, you know, all of the normal day-to-day stress has been multiplied by 10, the anxiety, the uncertainty, we're all staying together in the same place. So this kind of thing is, I think, even more important. It's always important, but it's even more important now. And hearing from people like you, and the fact that you took the time to write a book about this, I think is phenomenal. I think you're going to help a lot of people with your book and with your advice on this podcast and elsewhere. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, this was, you know, I want to say it was a lot of fun, but that might not be the right word given the topic, but it was super interesting to hear from you. And I hope we will be in touch again soon.
Yes. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Lessons from Leaders with Brian Beckham. If you've enjoyed this week's interview, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast and keep up with the latest episodes. You can also connect with Brian through his firm at vbattorneys.com.